everyone. Welcome back to the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube for the latest episode of Broncos Now. As always, I'm your host, Sydney Jones. And coming up on today's episode, we'll hear from head coach Sean Payton and several players as they take a look at Denver's initial roster, today's longer practice, and more. All that coming up. Broncos held another practice here at Centura Health Training Center today, and it was a bit of a longer practice today, and head coach Sean Payton seems pleased with the work the team put in. He spoke today on quarterback Russell Wilson and how he's picking up this offense.
Really good. Man, he's a tireless worker. At times we try to take tags he's familiar with in play design, because we're installing it for the first time, and if it's something that's clean for him, we can adjust. But, today we added a couple things for third down and red zone that we think we're going to use throughout the regular season. So that today was kind of back to the earlier question. Today was still more install, a little bit more training camp driven than it was next week driven.
Offensive tackle Mike McGlinchey added to that by discussing what he's seen from Russell Wilson the past few weeks of training camp and the preseason.
Well, I think he's been first and foremost, a great leader. I think he's been a constant workhorse, and I think he's ascending. I think that since the spring and since every day of training camp, you just see him get better and better. And for a player that's of his caliber, that's really special. And he's never satisfied. It's an attitude. It's a mindset that he takes in every single day. And Russ's passion for this game and the way that he improves and the way that he works rubs off on a lot of people.
Head coach Sean Payton announced today that Denver did not put a waiver claim on any eligible players before the deadline this morning as he detailed his approach to the Broncos' initial roster.
Remember, the art of the 53 sometimes is about protecting the most vulnerable or your assets that you think would be claimed or signed. I think the mistake sometimes is saying, hey, we need 5 at this position, 8 at this position, instead of the right 53 in order to really secure the roster the way you want it. And so you'll begin to see that take shape. And then, look, I said this yesterday, I just, from experience, the first week and a half, 2 weeks, beginning this time till, the next 2 weeks, you'll see the most roster movement around the league, and then it begins to calm a little bit.
He also described his philosophy on building the team's practice squad and how he chooses between bringing back players who were previously on this team and finding new players around the league.
I think if we feel like there's an upgrade, then we look at it closely. We kind of factor in a lot. It's a good question. And so, the meeting last night started with, the divisions, Atlanta, Arizona, all the way down to Tennessee, Washington, and every player's discussed, some very quickly, some longer, and then there's some tags that we apply to each player with each team, and then when the process ends, we go back, and now we're at 17 that we've tagged, and then we discuss, is it a claim tag or is it a practice squad tag? And it's pretty long. Then we go and begin to watch more film. Coaches then watch the film in the morning. It's a little different being on the West Coast because you've got to work later because your decision's got to come earlier. It is what it is. But I think the process went well.
Denver's initial roster featured 13 defensive backs, and safety Kareem Jackson spoke on that depth today.
We got a group of guys that can go play. From J-Mac to obviously Sang had a huge camp in preseason. I think we're pretty deep at all the spots in the secondary. So even with having the injuries, I think the guys stepped in. I think they played well. Everybody kind of got comfortable and got acclimated to the system. And, I think we had a pretty good camp.
Like I mentioned in yesterday's episode, the Broncos traded for Saints kicker Will Lutz. And Will Lutz was at practice today for the first time, and he spoke on what it means to be reunited with Sean Payton.
Yeah, look, today felt good. It's a good first day. We obviously have not much time to get used to each other. But, I got here this morning. I didn't know what the schedule was and walked into been in Mike's office, and they said, hey, you're going to kick today. I was like, cool. I'm tired. I've got 5 hours of sleep, but let's do it. But no, look, for Sean to come over and get me like he did, it's an honor. It's great to be appreciated. It's great to be wanted. And, man, I'm just really fired up for a fresh start and be out here.
Now joining me here inside the Broncos podcast studio is Broncos lead writer Eric Dalala. Eric, it was another hot one out there for practice today. Team was out there for a bit longer, too. It seems like head coach Sean Payton said it was more of a training camp-like practice as they're still, having some installs.
Yeah, they're, getting closer to regular season prep here. Sean Payton said upstairs in the coaching wing, they've started working on the Raiders, but down on the field, still focused on getting better as a team. They'll begin that transition to working on the Raiders on Monday. But, yeah, good practice, long practice. Not as many guys out there, obviously, following the roster cutdowns, but nice to see them get back to work.
Yep, the field kind of looked empty out there today.
It did. It did look empty, yeah.
Well, Eric, we heard head coach Sean Payton talk today about the Broncos not putting in a waiver claim on any eligible players before that deadline this morning. Were you surprised by that at all?
You just never know who's going to be available on the waiver wire, right? And then you don't know how the players that are available match up with what the team considers needs. We heard Sean Payton talk after the Rams game about certain hot spots on the roster. He didn't want to reveal any of those, so we don't know exactly where he's thinking those exist on this roster. But just because you don't add somebody to your active roster doesn't mean that you're not addressing that in other ways. And he said that he views that 16-player practice squad as an extension of the roster. And obviously the way the rules are set up where you can elevate guys for games, you can really use it in a way that, especially now that you can have veterans on the practice squad, you can use it in a way that it plays to your advantage. And you don't necessarily have to go out and add a guy to your active roster via the waiver wire. You can just get somebody to join your practice squad. And I did ask him about that balance of how do you decide when to bring guys back who are on your own team, your roster during the offseason versus going out and finding somebody new. And he said that part of that is going through the board and looking at everybody that you might potentially want and then saying, well, is this a guy we need to get to our active roster? Is this a guy we need to get to our practice squad? So just because the Broncos didn't go out and add anybody to their active roster doesn't mean they're not adding a few names. Obviously, we've seen some reports out there. So still able to add some talent, but you're right, not to the active roster. And I think that speaks to what they think about this roster. And again, not to ramble on here, but you look at 4 receivers versus a lot of DBs.
Right.
Sean Payton said, listen, that's more of a something that stems from who's vulnerable on your roster and who might get picked up. So
Makes sense.
It plays into that. The active roster, you can't look at the active roster without the practice squad.
Like you mentioned, Eric, this team is starting to assemble that practice squad. What do you like about some of the guys that they've brought back have been on the team previously?
Yeah, you look at a guy like Lil Jordan Humphrey, a veteran receiver, obviously with Jerry Jeudy's kind of dealing with that injury. I'm not going to go in short-term IR, but we don't know quite when he'll be back.
Right.
Having a guy like that, is helpful. A PJ Mustipher, for example, a young guy that you are able to bring back and let develop, and then you kind of look at the opposite spectrum there on the defensive line, a Tyler Lancaster. I think that's what the new practice squad rules let you do is you get some young guys that can develop, and maybe next year a Mustipher is a guy that challenges for a roster spot or eventually, becomes a guy like, listen, we've seen lots of guys around here, Sid, start off as practice squad players, and then they become full-time 53 guys, and they become starters. And so the path is not over for these guys, but then also it allows veterans who, maybe, I'm not saying it's the case for the guys on the Broncos practice squad, but there are guys that, hey, maybe you're not in the league anymore if these practice squad rules didn't exist. And so gives these guys a chance to keep playing, to stick around, to show they've still got it, to be active for a few games, maybe earn a more permanent spot on the 53-man roster. So I really like how this 16-man, and for the Broncos, really it can be 17 because you get an exemption for Hagai because of the International Player Pathway Program. And so, one of the things Sean said that stuck out is one of the things we learned from COVID among all the negatives were that having that increased roster flexibility and the increased practice squad, that was a good thing. And the NFL has obviously kept that. And I think it helps everybody involved. It helps teams and it helps young players and it helps veterans too.
Well, we saw kicker Will Lutz out at practice today. He said he flew out early this morning, of course, was with the team. seems like he's really excited for the fresh start here and to be working with Sean Payton again.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it was interesting listening to him. It kind of a vulnerable press conference in some ways. Talked about, hey, last year he felt like a rookie again. It was the first time he kicked in front of fans in a couple of years. Said he didn't handle that the right way. Obviously didn't have the season he wanted to last year, and kind of spent this offseason working on getting mentally stronger. We hear more and more players talk about that. And he obviously had a good training camp. The Broncos had an eye on him for a while, and he kind of knew, hey, the Broncos are one of those teams that I would be interested in if it came to that. And it ends up in Denver. I think it sounds like the pairing with Sean is good for him. He talked about how Sean Payton gets the most out of him because he doesn't want to let him down.
Yeah.
And so, listen, this is a guy we know has the leg talent. We know he's done it at a high level for a long time. He was a 2019 Pro Bowler. I mean, a good football player. And so to hear him talk about this fresh start and then to come in the way he did today and make a bunch of kicks,
right.
I think you're excited about what he could do here. And you add the altitude in, makes those kicks go a little bit further. Sure. It seems like the Broncos, knock on wood, could be set here at the kicker position.
Yep. And Eric, tomorrow's the last practice of the week for the Broncos as they head into the long weekend before the first game week. What did you like about how Sean's kind of approaching that weekend, this free weekend for the players?
Yeah, I mean, listen, they've got to give the players a certain amount of time off here. I think the message that's going to be delivered is you've put so much work in, and let's not throw that away here. And that's, obviously you see stories every year. Things happen. I don't think this is about that. This is more about from a conditioning standpoint, from a being mentally locked in. Hey, we've worked really hard to prepare ourselves to have a good season here. Yeah. Keep that up. Keep working out. Keep being dialed into your playbook. Be ready to come back Monday, ready to go and get to work on the Raiders because it's just week one, Sydney, but we know it's an important football game. And so you got to take time off. You got to get away. I think that's important for these guys to relax and rejuvenate a little bit, but you can't get too far away from it. It's kind of like that 6-week break on a much smaller scale, right? Where
after minicamp.
Yeah, where Sean Payton said, hey, it's hard to climb up that mountain, really easy to slip back down.
Right.
Broncos did a great job. Sean Payton was really pleased with how they came back from that break and approached training camp. Hopefully we see the same thing here over these few days ahead of next week.
Yep, looking forward to it. Eric, appreciate you coming on the show.
You got it, Sid. Thank you.
Well, that'll do it for today's episode of Broncos Now, Broncos Country. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll meet you right back here on the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube tomorrow for another episode. See you all then.